Welcome to Agreeableness. So in this video, we're going to talk about agreeableness. We're going to talk about the trait description. We're talking about the different facets of agreeableness. And then we're going to move on how to tell if someone you're talking to is agreeable. And this could also be a good way to know if you're agreeable yourself. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how agreeableness matches up and how it works with the other traits. For example, if you're agreeable and extroverted, what does that dynamic look like? So we're going to look at the combinations and permutations, because no one is just one thing. So before we jump into all that, be sure to subscribe and like the video if you love this sort of content. And also, if you have any questions, you can also text or email me. And before we get started, if you want to take a personality test, there's a free personality test in the link below. So be sure to take that before you learn all this stuff, because then it would skew your results a little bit. So what is agreeableness? So I want you to think of someone that is really warm, loving, caring, very maternal. And the best way to really get a grasp of these traits is to think of someone in your life that resembles them, and to think about how they would behave. And you really want, ideally, someone that is kind of like on the extreme end of the spectrum. So what are the traits for agreeableness? The traits are someone that is very warm, caring, someone that's going to be loving, someone that's going to spend time with you, someone that's going to give you their attention, someone who is genuinely interested in you. They inquire about you. They ask you questions. How's your day going? How things are going for you. They feel other people's emotions, and they have a general interest in people. They're very polite and respectful. They don't like to rock the boat. In fact, they have a hard time confronting issues to some degree. Of course, they avoid conflict. They're going to be very sympathetic, and they actually love to do things for other people. Obviously, they're not going to be pushy. They don't pose their will on other people. They're not going to pressure you to do something you don't want to do. And they're going to be very compassionate. So that kind of gives you an idea of agreeableness. Now let's look at disagreeableness, which is the other side of the spectrum. And I want you to keep in mind that both of these things have value, right? There's a reason why we evolved agreeable traits and why we evolved disagreeable traits. So one of the biggest markers for disagreeableness is competitiveness. So someone that's extremely competitive is going to be disagreeable. Someone that's really cooperative is going to be more agreeable. Someone that's more agreeable is also going to take the point of view and argue from the other person's position and negotiate on their behalf. That is in their own mind, cognitively. Someone that's disagreeable is only mostly going to care about their point of view. They're going to care more about winning at any costs, even if it's a win-lose. So people that are disagreeable are going to naturally be more critical, skeptical, hostile. They're going to push people to their limits. They're not going to be as trusting. They're going to be more blunt, and they're going to tell more harsh truths. So in terms of balancing both of these things out, I think good-natured versus irritable, someone that is courteous versus someone who is rude, someone that is forgiving versus someone who's vengeful, someone who's sympathetic versus someone who's callous. And this is a pretty good idea of agreeableness. Now let's look at the facets, because there's a couple of different ways where we could think of agreeableness, right? And the cool thing and the interesting thing about facets is that you could be really agreeable in one way and not so agreeable in another way. So for example, if we look at the Jordan Peterson model, he breaks down agreeableness in two major categories, in two major facets, and that is politeness and compassion. So politeness includes things like being respectful for rules, for authority, avoiding conflicts, not being controlling, not being pushy, not imposing your will, not being manipulative, right? That's being polite. Using good language. Being compassionate is like being highly empathetic, feeling other people's emotions, being interested in people, like genuinely you want to know about them, inquiring about them, taking time for them, doing things for them. That's the difference between compassion and politeness. Now there's other facets. So if you go to the Neo-Pi inventory, they have 6 facets. And in the literature, there's a little disagreement on how many facets there are, depending on which personality inventory you use. So with Neopi, you have 6 major facets. So the first one is compliance. Now, compliance doesn't sound very becoming, right? No one wants to be or think of themselves as being quote unquote compliant. So, and the literature has some depth to what it actually means by compliant, because what they mean by compliance is friendly conformity. In other words, someone that's highly agreeable is going to go along with the group or their friends or with you, and they're going to do or default to what you want to do just because it's easier, and they care more about spending time with you and you being happy than necessarily them getting to go to the restaurant or watch the movie that they want. That's of secondary importance to them. Another aspect of friendly conformity is the idea of a false positive. They don't want to do or see anything that's going to disturb the relationship. They want to maintain a positive relationship. So they're more likely to give people, you or a salesperson, for example, a false positive. And they say, yeah, I'm interested, yeah, I'll do it, and then not do it. And the other part of compliance is that they're actually harder to convince with bad arguments than people that are not as high in agreeableness. So they might give the impression that they agree with a bad argument, but deep down they actually don't agree with the bad argument at all, and they just want to go along with it because they don't want to disturb the social environment. And this brings us to a really interesting idea, and that is the perception of truth, right? Because someone that's disagreeable is going to look at all this and say, you know, all these white lies kind of add up. This isn't good, you know? And that's not that straightforward, because the way someone that's agreeable sees it, they see truth from more of a Darwinian point of view, which means that they're looking at the utility of truth with the goal of maintaining the relationship. And is it more important to tell someone that they're wrong about something trivial? Or is it more important to let them think however they want to think and maintain the relationship, and maybe down the line they change their mind anyway? So that's how someone that's highly agreeable would see it. They don't want to say or do something that's going to cause emotional harm or injury or hurt to another person. They'd rather that person and them have and maintain a good relationship. And that's one of the top motivations for high agreeableness, is maintaining positive relationships with other people. It's also part of the maternal instinct, right? It's the social glue that keeps society going. If we were to always point each other's flaws, which is something a disagreeable person would do, or someone that's extremely high in conscientiousness, that is being judgmental, you know, things would break apart. No one wants to hang out and be in that environment. So the next big facet for agreeableness is altruism. Again, altruism is a loaded word because it implies that there is no benefit to the self, right? You're doing something altruistic, completely and totally for somebody else without getting any benefit for yourself whatsoever. And it's very rare that you would find a situation like that. And more importantly, any situation like that would obviously have some cost associated with it, the effort itself. So is there such thing as altruism? And that's where the literature debates a little bit. They say, let's assume that altruism isn't the right word, and let's think of it more about pro-social behavior. And so what's a good example of pro-social behavior that people that are highly agreeable would engage in? And this leads us into like one of the major key motivations and insights about people that are high in agreeableness. So people that are higher in agreeableness are more likely to help someone in need. Okay? And that's why it gets labeled altruism. They're more likely to volunteer, for example. And the key reason is because they're highly empathetic. So imagine that you or someone you know who's highly agreeable, extremely agreeable, is in a situation where they see another person in pain. What happens, since they're so empathetic and compassionate, is their empathy shoots up. And they're automatically putting themselves in that person's shoes. And being in that person's shoes, their pain goes up because that person is experiencing pain. And at this moment, the person that's highly agreeable might prefer not to do something about it. They might prefer that someone else come and solves the problem or helps this person in need. But if there is nobody else, their pain persists. And so what they do is they engage in effortful control, and they help the person so that their own pain goes down. And that's kind of like an example of pro-social behavior. So not only are agreeable people the glue that keeps us going, socially it keeps us bound together, but they're also the ones that pick up people that fall down. And that's really important. Another facet is straightforwardness. They're very straightforward and honest. They're more likely to divulge information that is not in their long-term interests or satisfying some of their goals, compared to other types. Especially short-term goals that might be on the fringe. They might be related to impulsive decisions. Another part is trust. Again, they're higher in trust. They're more likely to trust people, and that includes people they don't know. And overall, that's a very good thing, because imagine if you lived in a society where you always assume that the other person is out to get you. You would have a hard time making any kind of interactions. You would be skeptical and critical of everything that everyone said. It would make it really difficult to move forward. However, if you trust people as a default, you're more likely to move forward. And when you live in a society where most people are trustworthy, it becomes the best strategy. And this is why people that are high in trust, that are more trusting of other people, have less social phobias. So there's a direct relationship between high trust and a low number of social phobias. The other thing that it's related to is risky sexual behavior. So the higher you are in trust and straightforwardness, the less likely you are to engage in risky sexual behavior. And part of the reason is again, because you're being straightforward on where you stand before the act occurs and what your intentions are, and you're trusting that the other person will reciprocate. And because the conversation is happening, it's less likely that a risky sexual situation will occur. Number 5 is modesty, right? So people that are high in agreeableness within the modesty facet, they have a sense of humility. They don't brag. They share their credit and so on. There's another model other than the Big Five. It's called the hexaco model, and it usually takes honesty and modesty and humility, and it creates a whole different category for them. It creates a 6th trait. But in what we're using right now, we're including this within agreeableness itself, modesty. And when it comes to management, this is the one trait that correlates really well with good management. And number 6 is tender-mindedness. So tender-mindedness is this ability to be able to empathize and relate to people that are not like you. So people that are high in tender-mindedness are going to have compassion and empathy for people that are outside their social group, out-group members, which means that they have really high tolerance. This is also the best predictor of sexism. If someone is really high in tender-mindedness, they're not going to be a sexist. They're going to be very low on sexism. So I hope that kind of gives you a pretty good understanding of the facets and the trait description. So let's talk a little bit about key motivations, and we've kind of hit on them a little bit here. So the first key motivation is that this is something akin to a maternal instinct, a social glue. And the maternal instinct makes sense. It's because, like, if you have an infant upstairs with your husband or wife, the last thing you want to do is argue about something non-consequential or something that's not that important. Because if you do, chances are you're going to wake the infant up, and then you're going to have a whole new mess, right? So it's best just to get along and move forward than to fight over every little thing. Also, another key motivation is maintaining positive relationships, right? They don't want to rock the boat. They want to just go along forward, get along with you, have a good time, and enjoy you. The other thing that agreeable people are really good is emotional resolution, right? They're really good at emotional control. So what does that mean? So let's say that someone that is high agreeable receives a present that they hate. Maybe this is the 3rd time they received this exact same present. It's Christmas. They're unpacking it, and then bam, it's the 3rd, watch that they received, or whatever the present is. they're going to experience a rush of emotion like anyone would, but they're the best at handling that emotion and suppressing it and moving forward. So there's this element in agreeableness that's effortful control. They're using effort to either suppress negative emotions for the good of the relationship. This will also happen in an argument, for example, the avoidance of the argument. Maybe they want to respond, but they're just going to suppress that feeling. And so that kind of gives you an overview of agreeableness, the trait descriptions, the facets, and the key motivations. So what are some of the outcomes, the life outcomes? What are the results of agreeableness? So there's a bunch of really good ones. So if you're high in agreeableness, you're less likely to be a delinquent, you're less likely to go to jail, you're less likely to engage in risky behavior, you're less likely to cheat, and you're less likely to be in the dark triad. So if someone is low in agreeableness, in other words, they're disagreeable, then there's overlap with the dark triad. That person might be a psychopath, for example. At the very least, they might be extremely manipulative. So when you meet people and they're high in agreeableness, you can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. They're probably not going to try to pull one over on you. They engage in less destructive acts. Obviously, they cheat less. They tend to be more of a caregivers, and so on. Now, what does it look like if you're too agreeable? Okay, so too agreeable, the downside is that they end up creating codependent relationships. And oftentimes in those codependent relationships, the other person depends more on them, so they put themselves last, right? They're putting everyone else first, and then they don't have time for themselves, or they don't get what they want, you know? And it becomes a sad thing. You know, they're the people that will give you the shirt off their back, and then at the end they don't have a shirt. So that's the downside of being too agreeable, right? And the downside of being too disagreeable is high incarceration rates. The number one trait to predict whether someone will go to jail in the future is if they're extremely disagreeable. And the more disagreeable they get, especially at the tail ends of the distribution, like you're talking about antisocial behavior, you're getting into the dark triad, you're getting into some very dangerous stuff. Also, being really disagreeable is not a great strategy long term, right? It's even in a hunting environment, which suits someone that's disagreeable, right? Because you have to have a certain, a knack to go out and hunt an animal and kill it and bring it home, right? You have to be able to put down the empathy and the compassion to some degree to do that. But you can only get so far being a lone wolf, right? The lone hunter doesn't get as far as the group of hunters. So even in a setting of a group of hunters that are very competitive with each other, they're also going to have a lot of elements of cooperation within themselves so they can move together as a unit, so they're more successful as a group. So that's agreeableness in a nutshell. So what are some of the markers of agreeableness? When you meet somebody, how would you know if they're agreeable? What are some of the occupations and hobbies associated with agreeable people? And how can you tell as quickly as possible that someone's agreeable? What's the best way to get along with them? So the good news is that it's very easy to get along with them, and it's somewhat easy to tell if someone is agreeable. So a lot of it you're going to be able to tell because of some of the things that they don't do and some of the things they feel uncomfortable doing. And it's going to become self-evident because to some degree, especially if you're a little bit more on the disagreeable side, it's going to perk up in you the things that they don't bring up, for example. And I can try to give some examples here. So first, let's talk about occupations, and then we'll talk about ways to tell if someone's agreeable or disagreeable. So in terms of occupations, anything in the caregiving space, nurses, etc., teachers, preschool teachers, caregivers, they're going to be higher in agreeableness, maybe substantially higher in agreeableness. Women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men on a normal distribution. Other ways you can tell that if someone's agreeable or disagreeable. If they're disagreeable, they're going to be competitive, and if you say something that they don't agree with, they might respond or say something snarky. They might be critical or skeptical of what you're saying, especially if it's if they don't agree with it. Someone that is agreeable will just go along with it. So that's a kind of like one way you can tell. Another way you can tell is that if someone's really agreeable, you're almost going to have a hard time even pushing their buttons, right? The only button, much of a button that you could push is situations where you yourself are disturbing or rocking the boat or putting unnecessary attention on them in that sort of way, right? In other words, if you're asking them to do something that goes outside the comfort zone of agreeableness. Another way you can tell if someone's highly agreeable is that they feel more responsible to explain themselves. So for example, if you had a meeting and they didn't show up or they were late or something like that, they're more likely to give you a justification or an explanation as to why that happened. If you ask them to do something and they say no, they're more likely to give you a bunch of reasons why they're saying no. Or someone disagreeable doesn't feel like they owe you an explanation, right? Other ways you can tell if someone is really agreeable is that if you ask them to do you a favor, they would like to do you a favor. They would enjoy doing you a favor. So they will do things for you. And then of course they're going to spend time with you. So agreeable people like to spend time with other people. That's probably one of their main hobbies. So if you ask someone, what do you do for fun? And they're like, oh, I like to hang out with my friends. That might be a marker of like, okay, this person might be agreeable. Let's find out what he likes to do with his friends. If he's playing competitive, boxing with them, probably not very agreeable. But if he's doing something else with them, especially if it's a cooperative endeavor, then now you have a marker for agreeableness. Another thing that agreeable people don't do is they don't gossip. They don't say things behind people's back. They're less likely to engage in it, and they would feel a little bit more uncomfortable going down that road. So now that we've talked about what it means to be agreeable and how to tell if someone's agreeable, now how does it work with the other traits? Because you're going to have some combinations and permutations, and not everyone's just agreeable. You could be agreeable and you could be high in openness, and you could be high in neuroticism, and you could be high in conscientiousness and extroversion. So how does all that play, right? How does it all play out? So this is how I think of it. First, when you're first telling or trying to read somebody, what you want to do is you want to figure out what their dominant trait is, right? And because the dominant trait is going to be the one they see the world through most often, right? That's going to be the lens that guides their behavior, that guides their goal setting, and the way they engage in the world, the way they move forward in it. So you want to figure out what the dominant trait is. So for this exercise, we'll assume that the dominant trait is agreeableness. So also, the other traits are going to come up as those situations arise in which they're useful, right? So for example, someone that's highly agreeable, if they go to a party and they're also an extrovert, well, yeah, they're going to be out there talking to everybody. They might be very gregarious. They might be charming, right? They're going to have that tool belt as well. If they're high in openness, they could be very philosophical or very artistic, or they could be like very dramatic, right? And they're going to be able to connect with you on an emotional level. That could be a very powerful combination. If they're highly conscientious, conscientiousness and agreeableness have a little bit of an overlap in terms of responsibility. So one way to think about conscientiousness is that in a way it's kind of a responsibility and a duty to tasks. And agreeableness is a responsibility and a duty to people, right? And responsibility itself has a very social element. It falls within conscientiousness, and someone who's responsible, someone that shows up to meetings on time, they keep their word, they don't change their mind often, they say what they're going to do, in other words, and all these things kind of have a social component to them, right? They keep their word, well, that relates to people. They keep appointments, that relates to people. They have a responsibility, an obligation, they feel like, to people, right? So this is where conscientiousness and an agreeableness overlap where responsibility has a foot in both camps. And neuroticism, and neuroticism is obviously like the fear component, having anxiety about doing things, being more aware of the dangers ahead, and being more vigilant of those dangers. Also has some overlap with agreeableness, and it has it in a few specific areas. So first is someone that's neurotic is more likely to have social phobia. Someone that's agreeable is less likely to have social phobia. So agreeableness is a good moderator for social phobia. If you're neurotic and you have social phobia, maybe you try to increase your agreeableness and your trusting, and you start with people that you're pretty sure you can trust already. Anger. So people that are high in neuroticism, they're volatile, for example, has a negative relationship with agreeableness. So if you become more agreeable, more empathetic, and more compassionate, you're less likely to get angry at other people because you could see their point of view more easily. And so the reason to get angry isn't there to the same extent. It also helps with depression. So if you're neurotic and you're in a state of depression, increasing agreeableness can help in that regard as well. So I hope this kind of gives you a good overview of agreeableness. And if you have questions about the other traits, extroversion, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism, check the links below. We have all those videos, or you can click up here and they should be in the playlist. So hope you enjoyed this. If you did, make sure you subscribe and like, and I'll see you in the next video.